Global borders are tightening under the guise of reciprocity and national security, reshaping the landscape of international mobility for American passport holders. Intelligence assessments indicate a deliberate pivot away from open access, driven by geopolitical tensions and resource strains in key destinations. This shift, accelerating in 2025, signals the erosion of long-standing privileges once afforded to U.S. citizens. Analysts observe that what began as isolated policy adjustments has coalesced into a broader pattern of restricted entry. The implications extend beyond travel inconvenience, potentially altering economic ties and diplomatic relations. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you're re-seeing on the ground so you stay a step ahead. Geopolitical realignments are fueling the closure of borders worldwide as nations reassess the costs of unrestricted mobility. Rising nationalism in emerging economies prompts leaders to prioritize domestic interests over foreign influxes. Economic pressures, including inflation and housing shortages, amplify local resentments toward high-volume tourism from wealthier countries. Intelligence reports highlight how post-pandemic recovery has exposed vulnerabilities, leading to policies that curb over-tourism and preserve cultural integrity. This global context reveals a strategic retreat from open-door eras, where mobility once symbolized soft power but now invites scrutiny. The reconfiguration of travel norms stems from bilateral frictions, where reciprocity clauses are invoked to mirror stringent U.S. visa protocols. Countries previously offering visa-free entry to Americans are reinstating requirements, citing fairness in diplomatic exchanges. This trend underscores a decline in the perceived value of U.S. alliances as host nations leverage border controls to negotiate trade or political concessions. Surveillance data indicates that these changes are not abrupt, but part of a calculated escalation, monitored through embassy channels. The underlying urgency lies in how such measures could cascade, affecting supply chains and expatriate communities. Mobility patterns are evolving amid heightened resource competition, with destinations like South America and Europe leading the charge in restrictive reforms. Analysts note that climate migration and demographic shifts exacerbate these dynamics, pushing governments to fortify frontiers against perceived external threats. Strategic briefings emphasize the role of digital economies in this transformation, where remote work blurs lines between tourists and residents. The result is a fragmented global map, where access once taken for granted now demands proactive navigation. This interconnected web of policies signals a paradigm where mobility is no longer a right but a negotiated privilege. In parallel, the erosion of trust in international agreements accelerates these border hardenings as nations invoke sovereignty to recalibrate inflows. Intelligence intercepts suggest that covert discussions in multilateral forums are debating standardized entry protocols to counter asymmetric travel freedoms. The urgency is palpable in how these changes disrupt established migration routes, potentially isolating economic hubs. For strategic planners, this represents a vulnerability in global connectivity, where unchecked restrictions could hinder intelligence gathering and alliances. The broader implication is a world where borders serve as tools of leverage, reshaping power dynamics one policy at a time. Transitions in global context naturally extend to the mechanics of passports and visas, where silent revocations undermine long-held exemptions. Visa waivers, once a cornerstone of U.S. travel ease, are collapsing under reciprocal demands from nations like Brazil and Argentina. Electronic travel authorizations, ETAs, emerge as gatekeepers, requiring pre-approvals that introduce layers of bureaucratic friction. Revocations occur without fanfare, often tied to minor discrepancies in applications, as seen in surge denial rates. This operational shift demands heightened vigilance, as intelligence indicates a pattern of targeted enforcement against frequent travelers. The proliferation of ETAs, such as South Korea's KETA, exemplifies how digital pre-screening supplants traditional entry stamps. These systems collect extensive data upfront, enabling host countries to filter entrants based on risk profiles compiled from international databases. Waivers once extended as diplomatic courtesies are now conditional, revoked amid shifting alliances. Analysts track how these mechanisms facilitate rapid policy reversals, catching travelers mid-journey. The strategic edge lies in anticipating such moves, where a single revocation can cascade into broader access denials across regions. Passports, long symbols of unfettered mobility for Americans, face devaluation through these understated collapses. In Europe, nations like Spain impose elevated financial thresholds, effectively revoking informal long-stay privileges. This mirrors a global trend where visa policies serve as economic regulators, deterring extended presences that strain local infrastructures. Intelligence assessments reveal coordinated efforts among blocs to harmonize these standards, amplifying their impact. The urgency underscores the need for diversified travel strategies to mitigate exposure to sudden exemptions losses. Revocations extend beyond paperwork to include tacit understandings, where countries quietly phase out leniencies for U.S. holders. Japan's subtle escalations in scrutiny illustrate how cultural preservation justifications mask strategic border tightening. These changes propagate through travel networks, prompting airlines and agencies to adapt protocols preemptively. Briefings highlight the risk of chain reactions, where one nation's revocation inspires others in the region. This interconnected vulnerability demands real-time monitoring to preserve operational mobility. The interplay of passports and visas feeds directly into enhanced security and surveillance frameworks at borders worldwide. Artificial intelligence now integrates into frontier systems, analyzing biometric data and travel histories in real time. Digital profiles aggregated from social media and transaction records inform risk assessments that can flag individuals preemptively. Risks in triaging escalate as algorithms prioritize patterns over context, leading to disproportionate scrutiny on certain nationalities. Intelligence operations note this as a pivot toward predictive enforcement, where borders become data-driven choke points. Surveillance extends to integrated networks, linking national databases for cross-border profiling that amplifies screening efficacy. In destinations like Turkey, online content scrutiny adds layers to entry evaluations, heightening risk for those with visible digital footprints. AI-driven tools automate these processes, reducing human oversight but increasing error margins in high-stakes decisions. Analysts observe that such systems, while efficient, introduce biases rooted in training data from geopolitical hotspots. The strategic imperative is to understand these mechanisms to navigate them without triggering alerts. Border security's evolution incorporates pervasive monitoring, where IoT devices at checkpoints capture behavioral data for profiling. This raises triaging risks, as minor anomalies such as itinerary vagueness can escalate to denials, as reported in Japanese immigration trends. Intelligence briefings emphasize the global standardization of these practices, driven by shared threat intelligence. For American travelers, this means elevated exposure, where digital hygiene becomes as critical as documentation. The urgency lies in how unchecked surveillance could normalize preemptive exclusions. AI's role in frontiers extends to predictive analytics, forecasting risks based on aggregated profiles that span continents. In Indonesia, social media monitoring exemplifies how digital trails influence physical access, amplifying triaging vulnerabilities. These systems, often opaque, challenge recourse mechanisms for erroneous flags. Strategic assessments indicate a trend toward ubiquitous surveillance, where borders serve as testing grounds for broader control architectures. This development demands adaptive countermeasures to preserve mobility in an increasingly monitored landscape. Perceptions of travelers vary sharply by nationality, with Americans encountering a recalibrated reception that contrasts regional norms. In Latin America, U.S. citizens face reciprocity-driven barriers, perceived as equitable adjustments by locals wary of asymmetric policies. Europeans, meanwhile, benefit from intra-bloc freedoms, highlighting the isolation of American privileges in global comparisons. Intelligence reports detail how these perceptions influence enforcement, with Americans often viewed through lenses of economic dominance. This disparity underscores a strategic realignment where nationality dictates the baseline of welcome. Regional contrasts emerge starkly as Asian nations like South Korea and Japan apply selective scrutiny, treating Americans with procedural caution absent in dealings with allied passports. Africans and Middle Eastern travelers conversely navigate even stricter regimes, but the shift for Americans represents a notable downgrade from prior exemptions. Local sentiments captured in media analyses frame U.S. visitors as resource consumers, fostering hesitancy in hospitality sectors. For strategic planning, understanding these perceptual gradients is key to anticipating entry dynamics. The urgency reflects how nationality-based views could solidify into enduring policies. Americans, once emblematic of unfettered access, now contend with perceptions of entitlement in hotspots like Bali, where digital nomads draw local ire. In contrast, Canadian or Australian counterparts often evade similar backlashes due to softer diplomatic footprints. Intelligence intercepts reveal forms where regional attitudes coalesce, influencing policy tweaks that target perceived overreach. This perceptual shift demands recalibrated approaches for U.S. travelers to mitigate friction. The broader implication is a world where nationality perceptions drive mobility hierarchies. Contrasts by region highlight how Europeans in Schengen zones maintain fluid movement, while Americans grapple with ETA mandates and visa reinstatements. In Turkey, perceptions tie to geopolitical critiques, amplifying scrutiny on U.S. passports relative to neutral nationalities. Analysts note that these views, shaped by media narratives, perpetuate cycles of restriction. Strategic briefings advise monitoring sentiment indicators to forecast perceptual evolutions. This investigative lens reveals the fragility of American travel status amid global realignments. Risks and consequences manifest in escalated detentions and summary deportations, where procedural lapses lead to swift expulsions. In Indonesia, overstays trigger rapid removals, with Americans comprising notable portions of enforcement actions. Small errors, such as incomplete ETAs, prove fatal to travel plans, resulting in boarding denials and financial losses. Intelligence assessments catalog these incidents as deterrents, designed to enforce compliance through exemplary measures. The strategic concern is how such consequences disrupt broader operational continuity. Deportations, often summary in nature, bypass traditional appeals, as seen in Bali's crackdowns on social media violations. For Americans, these risks compound with digital profiling, where a single post can precipitate detention at entry points. Consequences extend to blacklisting, barring future access, and complicating regional travel. Analysts track patterns indicating targeted enforcement where nationality influences severity. This urgency underscores the need for preemptive risk mapping to avoid cascading repercussions. Fatal small errors, like blurry documentation in South Korean screenings, cascade into denials that strand travelers mid-transit. In Spain, visa rejections for insufficient savings lead to abrupt relocations, with economic fallout for affected individuals. Intelligence reports highlight how these consequences serve national agendas, deterring informal residencies. The broader risk lies in how detentions erode trust in international systems. Strategic responses involve diversified contingencies to buffer against such vulnerabilities. Detentions in Turkey over online content illustrate how perceived threats yield severe outcomes, including interrogations and expulsions. Americans face amplified consequences due to geopolitical optics, contrasting lighter handling for other nationalities. Small errors in paperwork amplify the bans, as in Argentine reinstatements. Briefings emphasize the investigative value in tracking case data for predictive insights. This pattern demands heightened diligence to avert irreversible mobility losses. Scenarios Futuros project short-term intensifications, with medium-term implications for practical mobility strategies. Predictions indicate further ETA expansions in Asia, potentially encompassing 80% of destinations by 2027. Short-term, expect surges in denials tied to AI refinements, complicating spontaneous travel. Medium-term, reciprocal policies could standardize across blocks, isolating non-compliant nationalities. Practical implications include mandatory digital audits, pre-departure, reshaping planning protocols. Short-term forecasts highlight accelerated revocations in Europe, with Spain's thresholds inspiring similar hikes elsewhere. Medium-term geopolitical escalations may trigger blanket restrictions, affecting trade-linked mobility. Implications for Americans involve diversified passport strategies, such as dual citizenship pursuits. Intelligence projections stress the urgency in adapting to these trajectories. This forward-looking analysis positions proactive measures as essential for sustained access. Medium-term scenarios envision integrated global surveillance networks, where data sharing amplifies screening risks. Practical responses entail encrypted communications and itinerary obfuscation to evade profiles. Short-term, anticipate policy volatility in South America, with Argentina's moves cascading regionally. Implications extend to economic sectors reliant on mobility, prompting contingency relocations. Strategic briefings advocate for scenario modeling to navigate these evolutions. Predictions for the near horizon include heightened deportations and tourism-dependent economies balancing local pressures. Medium-term, technological advancements may introduce biometric mandates, altering entry paradigms. Practical steps involve real-time policy tracking via diplomatic channels. The investigative edge lies in anticipating these shifts to maintain operational agility. This outlook reinforces the imperative for adaptive frameworks in an unpredictable mobility landscape. In this era of recalibrated borders, strategic alertness remains paramount as the erosion of American travel privileges foreshadows broader geopolitical realignments. Stay informed, stay ahead. Subscribe now and join the conversation below.